Hey everybody, today I just want to do a quick video on the different numeric data types that are available in LabVIEW. So if you've been using LabVIEW for a minute, you're probably familiar with, at a minimum, floating point and integers. And if you've done programming in other languages as well, these terms are going to be familiar because they're the same across pretty much whatever language. Just kind of dive into each one, what they are, what ranges they cover, and then demo some things to be careful of in choosing a data type. So first off, integers. So we have those that start with an I and those that start with a U. So the ones that start with I are going to be your signed integers, which means they can be both positive or negative. Integer does mean, though, that this is a whole number, so no decimal places, anything like that. So this can represent any whole number, and then the number afterwards is basically how many bits are assigned to it. So 64-bit, 32-bit, 16-bit, 8-bit. So so we can basically choose whichever one we want. Obviously, the more the larger size we allow, the larger range that we can cover. So, for example, an I8 can cover from negative 128 to 127. I16, negative 32,768. And it gets exponentially larger the more space you allocate to it. An unsigned integer, those are the ones that start with a U. They only represent positive whole numbers. So, a U8, for example, represents 0 to 255. So we can definitely get higher with a U8 than an I8 on the positive side because we're not representing the negative half any longer. So if you only need to represent positive numbers, U8s are a great choice because you can expand how far that number can go while taking up less space. So you also have your 8, 16, 32, and 64 of those. Those are kind of your integer data types. And if you ever need to change the type of a numeric, right, I can just drop a numeric down. If I right click on it and go to representation, I can then basically change the type. So I can see I've got my I64, 32. So here's all my signed integers, my unsigned integers. Here's some floats that we're going to talk about, and then complex down there. So I can just go here and I can change it to whatever I want. Next thing I wanted to talk about is floating point numbers. So these are probably the ones that you use the most in LabVIEW. The type of stuff we're doing, data acquisition, stuff like that. A lot of time we're using floating point numbers. So these are numbers that will have a decimal place. So 1.1, right? We can't represent 1.1 with an integer. It would just be 1. But with floating points, we can now represent decimal places, and there's different levels of precision to that that we can use. So there in LabVIEW we have single precision, double precision, and extended precision. Single precision is going to be a 32-bit IEEE floating point number. So this gives us this range here, which is a very large range, and that gives you about 8 decimal places. So you can represent a lot of different stuff with a single precision float. Double precision is a 64-bit IEEE floating point, which you can note, if you notice, is exponentially larger, the range that it can cover, and that gets you about 16 decimal places. And then extended precision is a 128-bit float, and this gets you plus or minus 10 to the 4,932nd, which is about 34 decimal places of precision. So you can represent the same number with all three of these, but you basically can get further and further precision the larger you use. And then complex numbers. So these are going to be basically the same as your floating point numbers, but they're going to contain a real and an imaginary component to them. So your floating point is just going to be 1.1, whereas your complex is going to have, it could be there's going to be both a real and imaginary component. You could have 1.1 of the real component and 2.2 of the imaginary component. So not, at least in the worlds that I've worked in with LabVIEW, I have only ever once used complex numbers. Not to say that they aren't ever used, just in the fields that I work with them, I never seem to need them. But yeah, they're there, so you can do complex, arithmetic and whatnot, and work with complex numbers directly in LabVIEW. And you also have a single, double, and extended, which represents the same representations of 32-bit, 64-bit, and 128-bit. And then there's one other special case, and that is going to be fixed point numbers. So most commonly, you're going to see this in FPGA applications. I've seen it a tiny bit outside of FPGA, but not all that much. So fixed point numbers are basically a way where you can use integers to represent elements of what would be like a floating point number. So a little note here, decimal point is fixed, unlike floats. Fixed denoting the fixed point. So we have an integer component and a fractional component, right? So we have basically digits, before the decimal place and digits after the decimal place. And I can use basically integers to represent that. And I can control basically the size of that fixed point number, right? So I'm not bound to things like 32-bit, 64-bit, 128-bit. I can specify the integer size I want to allow in front of the decimal place and after the decimal place. And like I said, this is most commonly used in FPGA. If you're not doing much FPGA programming, I wouldn't worry too much about it at the moment. It's on my to-do list to start making some FPGA videos. So when I get into that, I'll start talking about fixed point numbers a little more in detail if you're interested, and kind of how to do some fixed point math and things to be careful of. So yeah, those are kind of the numeric data types in LabVIEW. You have your integers, floating point numbers, complex numbers, and you have your fixed point, which is kind of a special case. It's not really an integer and it's not really a floating point, but it's something kind of in between. Like I showed, you can easily change the type just by going to representation, and you can change it to whatever you want. Now, one thing I just wanted to show, I have this just super simple demo. So we've got a numeric, and we're just adding the number 5 to it and outputting the result. I do have this set to a U8 though, which means we're an unsigned 8-bit integer. So if you notice, that represents from 0 to 255. So I can do something like set this to 200, right? And I can add that number, and I get 205 just like you would expect. I can also go ahead and set this to 250, and you get 255 just like you would expect. But if I set this to 251, the result you get is actually 0. And the reason for that is we have rolled over the maximum allowed limit of an unsigned 8-bit integer. So it actually rolls over and basically restarts the count. So if I went up 1 higher, I actually get a result of 1. So we've gone past the 255 limit, started over at 0, and then incremented that 1 further. And again, as I keep going, it'll just keep getting 1 higher. So one thing to be careful of when you're choosing which data type to use is making sure that for whatever your application is, making sure that the range covers what you're trying to do, right? If you're creating a counter, well, make sure that however far you might be counting is usable by the type of numeric value you've selected. So if that is a U8, well, if you're only ever counting up to 60, like maybe your timer counts to 60 seconds, right? Well, a U8 works great for that, right? You're always going to be between 0 and 255, and you're never going to be negative time. So a U8 works great. But if you were counting how long your software's been running, and it could be running for several days, that'll be problematic, right? Because it's going to constantly be rolling over. So, but at the same time, you don't want to just choose the largest size for everything, just in case. Because again, that's just going to use up more memory. It's just going to take up extra space that you don't really need. So there's a fine balance, right? And kind of just figuring out, what representation is good to give me some, give me the space that I need, but not be overly consumptuous. And the same goes for floating point numbers, right? I could just set absolutely everything to be extended precision, but it's going to use up a lot more memory that way. And a lot of the times, actually, I've never had an application where I've needed something like, or even remotely close to 34 decimal places. Not to say that application doesn't exist out there, but I have never needed more than like maybe 5 or 6 decimal places on anything. So using a single or a double saves you a lot of space, and it still gives you great precision and representation. So just want to highlight, you really need to think about what this number represents in terms of in your software, and pick an appropriate representation, right? Whole numbers, you're looking at integers. But again, think, do you need an unsigned or signed? And what representation is going to be good for your application? For floating point, single and double is basically what you need, 99% of the time. There are some small applications where you will want to use extended precision. But for most cases, double, single is great. Complex, obviously, anytime you're working with complex numbers, you need to use complex. And then fixed point, like I said, mostly an FPGA thing, but there are I have seen it used outside of FPGA as well. And I'll create another video talking about that a little bit more. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. That would be numeric data types in LabVIEW.
Canon Controls is your gateway to mastering LabVIEW. Dive into programming for data acquisition, industrial communications, and manufacturing automation. Explore how to enhance your projects with cybersecurity best practices. Join the journey to elevate your skills and secure your systems with every episode.